Hello everyone, welcome to this module where we talk about cluster migration to Windows Server 2012. My name is Richard Chi, I'm Technical Evangelist for Microsoft. Okay, there are usually two main approaches that you can actually take to migrate your cluster to a Windows Server 2012 cluster. The first one is actually migrate between two multi-node clusters, where what you literally do is create another cluster running on Windows Server 2012, and then you actually use the cluster migration wizard to move all the VMs or any of the services and applications that you have to the new cluster. Now this actually requires you to have two clusters running at the same time. Now there's another approach, probably more common to people who have less hardware, or you have limitations on how many hardwares you can get in your environment. So depends on how many nodes you have in your cluster. You might have a 2-node cluster or 4-node cluster. What you do is you actually evict 1 or 2 nodes. Depends on how many VMs you have running and how many services and applications you have in your old cluster. You evict 1 or 2 nodes from your cluster, and then you will actually upgrade these 2 nodes to a Windows Server 2012, and then rebuild them from scratch, and add the Hyper-V and cluster role to both nodes, and then create a cluster based on these 2 nodes. And then what you can do is run the cluster migration with it, is actually move all the VM or services and applications from the old cluster to the new cluster. So once it's done, everything up and running, what you will do is you basically destroy the old cluster, and then you actually rebuild all the old nodes and then join them to the new Windows Server 2012 cluster. There are some of the questions that I get it very typically. People say, hey, there are some new capabilities in Windows Server 2012, capabilities like share nothing like migration, Hyper-V replica, etc. Can those capabilities be used to migrate VMs from a cluster to another? Well, you can, provided your both of your clusters are actually running on Windows Server 2012, and then cluster migration wizard actually give you some of the benefits, things like minimize your downtime, especially most of the times you will have 2 clusters actually connected to the same storage. You will also help you to migrate services and applications. So if you have file server role, if you have other services running, you can actually migrate the cluster services as well. The third thing is that you might have guest clusters where you have a cluster running in the VMs. You have any services and applications running there, the cluster migration wizard actually help you migrate those as well. So you can migrate both clusters which runs on your physical cluster or your guest cluster VMs. Now let's look at a little bit more in terms of what are the source target OS operating systems that support it, and what are the target operating systems supported. So if you are using cluster migration wizard, you basically have 3 types of source cluster nodes that's being supported. One is your Windows Server 208, the other one is your Windows Server 208R2, and of course you can do Windows Server 2012. The target cluster nodes has to be Windows Server 2012. Now there are some things that you need to take note. For you to use your Windows Server cluster migration wizard, you always run the migration wizard from the target cluster, which meaning your Windows Server 2012. And your source cluster, you have to have the latest service packs, meaning when you're using Windows Server 208, you have to upgrade to the Service Pack 2, okay, before you do the migration. If you are running Windows Server 208R2, you are required to actually upgrade to Service Pack 1, okay? You need those upgrade or service packs before you can actually start the migration. All right? Now let's go for a quick demo now. So what I will do is I will go to my demo environment. Okay, what I have here is actually a 2-node cluster built on Windows Server 2008R2 Service Pack 1. So as you can see here, and the services and applications, I actually have 2 VMs. One is my web VM, the other one is my SQL VM. This is actually a typical 2-tier applications that I have. One VM runs the web front end, and the other VMs actually runs the SQL servers for the specific web server. Now, you need to be very careful here. So SQL Server, if it sits in a VM, I can actually just migrate it over straight away. Because to the cluster migration wizard, it doesn't really matter what you run in the VM. As long as it's a VM, I can actually migrate straight away. Now, if this is a SQL Server role, a SQL Server services that I'm running on my fieldwork cluster, you might have some additional steps that you actually need to perform. But when it's a VM, there's really nothing else for me to do. I just simply migrate the VM over. Now, in terms of storage, I actually have 2 storage. One is for my quorum, the other one is actually my CSV. So these 2 actually I use as SCSI target. So I will show you later on how I actually migrate the CSV over as well. Okay. Now, what I have on the other hand is actually my Windows Server 2012 cluster, which is a new cluster that I actually built. Now, this can be your new cluster that you created, or this can be the state that you say, hey, I took out a 2-node from my previous old cluster, what we call in-place migration, and build this new cluster here. Now, you can build this, as I have. I actually built a CSV volume here, as well as my quorum. What I want to demonstrate to you is that how we can migrate the CSV from the old cluster to new cluster, and even though they have a name conflicts, you can still migrate those CSV over. I want to show you that capability. But if you have limitations on storage, what you can do is just create a cluster without adding your CSV or any disk storage. And then once you migrate those services, once you migrate the storage over, you can actually online the new CSV storage straight away. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to go to my Windows Server 2012 cluster. I'm going to go to the right-click on it, go to More Actions, and under Migrate Roles, I'll basically click on it, click Next. Now, here is basically where I key in the cluster names. For example, my source cluster in my case is actually 208 cluster. Okay. Now you can either enter the cluster name or you can actually browse. Now it depends on how many clusters you have. If you're running a very big environment, this might take a while. It will actually go and populate all the clusters that you have in your environment. So for me, most easy way is just key in the cluster name, click Next. You actually go and connect to the old cluster, verify what are the services, applications, or VMs that we can actually migrate over. So once it's connected and validated, you can see here straight away I got a few options here. I actually see the cluster volume, as well as I see the VMs that are actually running on my cluster volumes. Now, if I have multiple cluster share volumes, I will see multiple cluster share volumes here. And I can select different VMs, different services, and applications from different cluster share volumes. Now, I want to bring your attention here. So you will notice here, I have 2 VMs all listed. Okay, what's going to happen is when I select any of the VM, okay, it will actually select the whole thing. What happens is my cluster migration wizard actually recognize this is 2 services and applications that are running on the same cluster share volume. So it actually makes sense for me to actually migrate them all together. Okay, so you can see now when I click one, you actually select the whole volume. If I just click the other one, it actually does the same thing. Now, before I migrate, here I actually have a view report option. This is what we call pre-migration report. So if I click on the report, you actually give me a very nice report to say, hey, there are a few things that you're going to migrate here. I have looked at my available storage cluster group, and the 2 VMs I want to migrate, they will migrate successfully. Now, this, when you see the alert, you kind of, hey, what's going on here? There are 2 things I can't migrate over, but you don't have to worry about it because you can't really migrate your cluster group directly over, right? And your available storage, this is basically say, hey, these 2 can be migrated, okay? But the problem is, you already have these 2 there, but it will be, you can still migrate over, but it will be reactivated with a different name, okay? Now, these 2 error is usually pretty okay if you see them, okay? Now, I'm going to close the report. I'm going to click next. Now, here, this is where it will basically ask me, hey, what are the new network switch, virtual network switch that you're going to use when you migrate over? This is basically allow me to say, hey, when you migrate from the old cluster to the new cluster, which virtual network I want the cluster to connect to, okay? This basically help you to speed up, so minimize downtime that you have to configure all the networks, etc. Okay, once I've done that, I will click next. It will give me all the summary information. I will click next, and that actually starts migration. Now, once migration is done, what I have here is what we call a post-migration report. So click on View Report. It will actually give me a detailed report, say, hey, what has been migrated, what's the status, so I can see here both are very successful. So I will just close my report. Now, once it's done, I will click Finish. So once finished, I go to Roles. You can see here, now both of the VMs are migrated over, and both are in offline state. If I go to disk, okay, this is where you can see, hey, I have the new cluster share volume being migrated over, and because I already have this one, so this is automatically named as this one bracket 2. So you automatically rename the cluster share volume for me. Now, the cluster share volume will also be in offline state. Basically, I will choose later on when do I want to migrate my physical LAN, do the masking and move it over. Now, this is where you actually will decide to talk to your storage team if your storage team does the LAN management for you. So this is where basically you say, hey, let's prepare to do a LAN masking so that I will switch the old LAN to the new LAN. Or you basically say, hey, I'm actually using a new storage. I will actually make sure all the things in the old storage LAN are copied to the new storage LAN. Okay? Now, this is pretty much done in terms of migration. Now, if I go back to my 208R2 cluster, you can see that my cluster VMs are still online. Now, this is where you will start to have a minimum downtime. Now, this is basically where I say, hey, I'm going to shut down all the old VMs in the old cluster. I'm going to take offline the old cluster share volume. And you tell your storage team, say, hey, let's do the masking now. Or we already done the copy from new LAN from the old LAN to the new LAN. Now let's make the switch. Okay? And then you will power up your role and services from the new cluster. Okay, so this is the minimum downtimes that you're going to have. And for most of the case, because 2 of your clusters will likely leverage the same storage, you will actually have very bare minimum downtimes, okay, like what I have here. So it's really up to how fast you can move around the UI. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shut down my, I'm going to shut down my web VM first, okay. Shut down my web VM. Are you sure? Yes. And then I will actually shut down my SQL VMs as well. Okay. Now both VMs is shut down. That's where I go to my cluster share volume, and then I will actually take this resource offline. Okay. So it will take my cluster share volume in my old cluster offline. All right. Once this is done, I will move back to my new cluster which runs Windows Server 2012. I will go to the cluster share volume and say, hey, bring this share volume online. And then I will go to my roles and say, bring my SQL Server online, start it, and then also start my web server. Okay, now by now, because I'm both of my clusters utilizing the same storage, straight away my migration is done. So that 60-90 seconds when I move around the UI, try to start the VMs, I try to shut down the VMs and start the VMs, basically all the times that I need to actually make the switch. And that's all the downtimes that you have. Now, you could, instead of using the UI, actually use PowerShell, right? You'll probably much faster than you move around the UI, so it probably take just a few seconds. So write a PowerShell script, use the PowerShell script to basically shut down the VMs in your old cluster, take off the cluster share volume, and then use the PowerShell script to bring online the new cluster share volume and bring the VMs online. Now that's pretty much it. A very quick demo in terms of how, what are the steps that you do to migrate your cluster over. Now there are some of the resources you may want to get to. First of all, I always tell IT pros the best way to learn things is always to try it out. And I'm sure you guys love hands-on. So make sure you go to download the Windows Server 2012. Either download the ISO to build it your own or download the Evolve HD. So I actually have a very short URL for you, aka.ms/winsrv2012. And also a lot of the clustering features and clustering capabilities are on the clustering team blog. What you can do is go and visit the blog msdn.com/clustering to actually get more details on the new clustering capabilities in Windows Server 2012. Well, thank you for your time for this module, migrating your clusters to Windows Server 2012.